Lila Monroe was 28, the kind of woman who could vanish into a crowd if she wanted to. But her green eyes, sharp and alive like the Vermont woods, gave her away every time. She grew up in Ashwood, a tiny dot on the map where the biggest event was the fall harvest fair, and the air always smelled faintly of pine and cider. Her mom, Grace, raised her alone after her dad died in a car wreck when Lila was just 10. It was a brutal loss. Her dad had been her hero, always lugging around an old Nikon camera, teaching her to frame the world through its scratched lens. That camera was hers now, a beat-up relic she carried everywhere, snapping shots of quiet moments, a kid chasing leaves, a deer at dusk, Grace laughing over tea. Life in Ashwood wasn't glamorous. Lila freelanced as a journalist, scraping together stories for local papers, but it barely paid the bills. Most days she slung coffee at the town's only diner, the tips just enough to keep the lights on. Then Grace got sick, really sick. Her lungs were failing, each breath a rasp that tore at Lila's heart. The doctors said she needed surgery, a $100,000 lifeline Lila couldn't even dream of affording. She'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, the weight of it crushing her. Grace was all she had left. One gray afternoon, a letter slipped under her door, changed everything. No return address, just a crisp envelope with a proposal inside. Marry a stranger, stay married for a year, then walk away with a payout, enough to save Grace. It was shady, sure, but desperation has a way of blurring the lines. Lila's hands shook as she read it, her mind racing. She pictured Grace fading away, those warm brown eyes closing for good, and that was it. She couldn't say no. She signed the contract, sent it off, and a week later, a proxy wedding was done. She didn't meet the guy, didn't even know his name, just a few curt texts to sort out the legal stuff. Money hit her account the next day and Grace got her surgery. Lila could breathe again, but she felt like she'd sold a piece of herself. Halfway across the country in Boston, Ethan Blackwell didn't have time for fairy tales. At 32, he was the CEO of Blackwell Media, a sprawling empire of news outlets and digital platforms his grandmother Margaret had built from the ground up. He was all sharp edges, black hair slicked back, jawline like it was carved from stone, and a stare that could freeze a room. Ethan didn't just run the company, he owned it. Every decision, every dollar. But there was a catch. Margaret's will had a clause. He had to be married by 35 or the board, vultures in tailored suits would swoop in and take it all. His 35th birthday was 3 years off, but Ethan wasn't a gambler. He'd seen love turn sour. His mom walking out when he was a kid, his dad a wreck after. So marriage to him was a contract, not a promise. He found the same shadowy matchmaking outfit Lila had stumbled across. They promised discretion, a wife on paper, no mess, no feelings. Ethan signed up, figuring he'd ride it out and ditch her when the year was up. He didn't care who she was, just another name on a dotted line. The wedding happened remotely, a signature swapped through lawyers, and he barely glanced at the details. A few texts later, sign here, got the certificate, it was done. His empire was safe. And that's what mattered. He tossed his phone aside, already back to emails, the whole thing a blip on his radar. Lila and Ethan didn't know it, but they were tied together now, two strangers with everything to lose. She was fighting to keep her mom alive, her camera slung over her shoulder like a shield. He was racing to lock down a legacy, his office a fortress of glass and steel overlooking Boston's skyline. They'd never met, never heard each other's voices. Just words on a screen, a deal sealed in secret. It should have been simple. A year, a divorce, a clean break. But life's got a funny way of flipping the script, and theirs was about to get messy. Lila sat on her creaky porch that night, the Vermont stars winking above, and typed a quick message to her mystery husband. Long day, hope yours was better. Miles away, Ethan sprawled on a leather couch in his penthouse, the city humming below, and shot back, same. Work's a grind, you holdin' up? Neither had a clue who was on the other end, or that their worlds were about to crash into each other. Lila Monroe packed up her life in Ashwood a few weeks after Grace's surgery. The hospital bills were paid and her mom was breathing easier, but Lila's savings were toast. She needed a real job, something more than diner shifts and freelance gigs that barely covered gas. Boston was her shot. A city she'd only seen in photos, a far cry from Vermont's sleepy hills. She'd landed an interview at Blackwell Media, a big-name outfit that churned out magazines and breaking news. With her journalism chops and a portfolio of small-town stories, she figured she had a chance, even if her resume was thin. She threw her dad's old Nikon into a duffel, pulled on a faded gray sweater dress, best thing she owned, and caught a bus to the city. Stepping into Blackwell Media's lobby felt like walking onto another planet. The place was a maze of glass and chrome, people in crisp suits darting around, their voices clipped and urgent. Lila clutched her folder of clips, articles about Ashwood's floods, a profile on the town's oldest farmer, her palms sweaty. Her dress, cozy back home, looked shabby here, the hem frayed from too many washes. She caught her reflection in the elevator doors and winced. She didn't belong, not yet, but she squared her shoulders anyway. This wasn't about fitting in, it was about proving she could. The interview room was a sleek box, all white walls and a long table. 3 people sat across from her, but the one who stood out was Vanessa Hart. Mid-30s, blonde hair pulled tight in a bun, Vanessa had a smile that didn't reach her eyes, like a shark sizing up dinner. She was the head of HR, and the second Lila walked in, Vanessa's gaze raked over her head to toe. "Well, well," she said, voice dripping with something sharp. "Did you pick that dress out of a thrift bin? This isn't a charity drive, sweetheart." The guy next to her, a wiry dude with glasses, snickered, and the third, a woman with a tablet, just smirked. Lila's cheeks burned, but she sat down, spine straight. "I'm here for the reporter job," she said, keeping her tone even. "My work's in the folder." Vanessa flipped through it, barely glancing at the pages. "Small town floods. Huh? Cute. We don't do puff pieces here. Why should we waste a desk on someone with no real experience?" Lila swallowed the knot in her throat. "Because I dig for the truth," she said. "I've spent years finding stories where people think there's nothing to tell. Give me a shot, and I'll show you." Vanessa leaned back, crossing her arms, that smirk still plastered on her face. "We'll see," she said, like she'd already decided Lila was a lost cause. Upstairs, Ethan Blackwell was buried in his corner office, a wall of windows framing Boston's jagged skyline. Papers stacked high, phone buzzing nonstop. He'd barely had time to breathe, let alone think about the wife he'd roped into his inheritance plan. His assistant Miles had emailed him a batch of new hire files, and Ethan scrolled through them half asleep. One name popped out: Lila Monroe. He paused, frowning. Same name as the woman he'd married on paper. Weird coincidence, but he shrugged it off. Monroe wasn't exactly rare. He grabbed his phone and shot a text to her, the mystery wife he'd never met. "Rough day, too many clowns applying for jobs. You?" Downstairs, Lila sat in the lobby, waiting for a verdict, and her phone pinged. She typed back, "Same, just got shredded in an interview, fingers crossed." Neither knew they were orbiting the same damn building. Vanessa didn't want to hire her. Lila could tell from the way she'd tossed the folder aside, but someone higher up must have overruled her. A grudging call came an hour later. Reporter trainee, bottom rung, barely above minimum wage. Lila took it without blinking. It was a foot in the door, a paycheck to send back to Grace. She started the next day, desk shoved in a corner near the coffee machine. Vanessa was her boss, and she made it clear from minute one that Lila was dirt under her heels. "Get me a latte," she'd bark, "or fix these typos. Don't screw it up, Ashwood." The nickname stung. Vanessa had caught it from Lila's resume and wielded it like a knife. The rest of the team followed her lead, whispering, "Country girl," when Lila passed, their laughs low and cutting. Lila didn't flinch, not outwardly. She'd dealt with worse, bullies in school, nights wondering if Grace would make it. She'd buried herself in work, tweaking copy, chasing leads on tiny stories nobody else wanted. At night, she'd crash in a cheap rental, a shoebox with peeling paint, and text her husband. "Boss is a nightmare. Thinks I'm trash. You ever feel like that?" Ethan, sprawled in his penthouse, glass of bourbon in hand, would reply, "All the time. My team's full of sharks. Keep your head up." It was weird how easy it felt, venting to this faceless guy. He got her, somehow, and she got him. She didn't know he was watching her, not really. Ethan caught glimpses, her lugging a stack of files, chatting with the janitor, Harold, like he wasn't invisible. Most people stepped over Harold, but Lila crouched to pick up a mop he'd dropped, smiling like it was nothing. Ethan saw it from the stairwell once, her green eyes catching the light, and something stuck with him. He didn't know why. Not yet. Lila was in over her head, sure, but she wasn't drowning. Vanessa could mock her all she wanted, those snide jabs about her clothes, her roots, but Lila had fire. She'd prove it one story at a time. And Ethan? He was starting to wonder about the girl with the beat-up camera, the one who kept popping up in his world, even if he didn't know she was already his. Lila Monroe had been at Blackwell Media for a couple of months, and it felt like walking through a minefield every day. She'd carved out a tiny corner for herself, desk piled with notes, her dad's Nikon tucked in a drawer, but the air around her buzzed with sharp edges. Vanessa Hart was relentless. She'd swan by Lila's spot, heels clicking like gunfire, and drop some cutting remark. "Ashwood, you call this a lead? My dog could dig up better." Then came the smirks from the team, the ones who dubbed her country girl behind her back. Lila kept her head down, fingers flying over her keyboard, chasing stories about local startups or city council scandals. Small potatoes, but she made them sing. Her latest piece, a deep dive on a shady landlord, even got a nod from an editor upstairs. Not that Vanessa cared. One morning, Lila stayed late to finish it, the office dim and quiet except for the hum of her laptop. She'd poured everything into that story, interviews, photos, the works. She hit save, stretched, and headed out, feeling a flicker of pride. Next day it was gone. File wiped, desk drawer empty. Vanessa leaned against the wall when Lila stormed up, all innocence. "Oh, did I overwrite that? My bad, must have slipped." Her lips twitched, barely hiding a grin. Lila's stomach dropped, hours of work dust, but she clenched her fists and nodded. "I'll redo it," she said, voice tight. Vanessa's eyes glinted. "Good luck, country girl." She didn't cry, not there. She saved it for the bus ride home, tears hot and silent, the city lights blurring outside the window. When she got to her dingy apartment, she flopped onto the sagging couch and grabbed her phone. "Work's hell," she texted her mystery husband. "Boss trashed my stuff on purpose. Ever had someone hate you for no reason?" Miles away, Ethan Blackwell lounged in his penthouse, tie loose, a glass of something strong in hand. His phone lit up, and he smirked, typing back, "Yeah, plenty. Half my board wants me gone. Don't let her win." Lila smiled, faint but real. This guy, whoever he was, always knew what to say. "Trying," she replied. "You're my sanity lately." Ethan read it, a weird warmth hitting him. "Same," he shot back. It was becoming a habit, these late-night vents, a lifeline neither saw coming. Ethan didn't get why he kept noticing her. Lila, the new girl with the messy hair and the camera she hauled everywhere. He'd catch her in the halls sometimes, head bent over a notepad, or laughing with Harold, the janitor nobody else bothered with. One day, he'd lingered by the break room, watching her help Harold stack chairs after a spill. Nothing big, just her kneeling there, chatting about his grandkids. Most people treated Harold like furniture, but Lila didn't. Ethan's chest did a funny little twist, and he brushed it off, heading back to his office. Still, he texted his wife that night. Saw someone decent today. Rare around here. Lila, curled up with tea, replied, same. Little wins, right? They were circling each other, blind as bats. Trouble started brewing when Claire Dawson walked into the picture. She was 30, all sleek red hair and confidence, striding into Ethan's office unannounced one afternoon. Hey, husband, she said, tossing a marriage certificate creased and official looking onto his desk. Ethan's jaw tightened. What the hell's this? Claire smirked, leading in. Or little deal. I'm your wife, Blackwell. Agency says so. I'll keep quiet for 5 million or I spill to the board and your grandma's will goes poof. Ethan stared at the paper, then at her. He'd signed something, sure, but this felt off. Get out, he said, voice low. I'll check it. Claire laughed, sharp. Check all you want. Pay me or you're done. She didn't leave empty-handed. She'd already sniffed out Vanessa. The two met that night at a bar downtown, all dark wood and cigarette haze. Vanessa swirled her drink, eyes narrow. He's been eyeing that new girl, Lila. Thinks she's special. Claire sipped her vodka, cool as ice. Then we bury her. I need Ethan focused on me, not some nobody. Help me and I'll cut you in. Vanessa's smile twisted. She'd been at Blackwell since Ethan was a rookie, back when he was just a brooding kid with big ideas. She'd loved him once, quietly, stupidly, and watching Lila catch his eye burned her raw. Deal, she said. They clinked glasses, a pact sealed. Next day, Vanessa turned up the heat. She dumped a stack of old press releases on Lila's desk. Rewrite these by lunch, she snapped. Don't mess up, Ashwood. Lila nodded, swallowing the sting, but she heard the whispers later. Vanessa in the break room, loud enough to carry. That girl's after Ethan. Gold digger vibes, right? The team ate it up, heads turning when Lila walked by. She pretended not to notice, but it cut deep. She texted her husband that night, fingers shaky. People at work think I'm chasing the boss. I just want to do my job. Ethan, pacing his penthouse, fired back, screw 'em. They're jealous. My crew's spreading crap about me too. Lila laughed, soft and tired. We're a mess, huh? Yeah, he replied, but we've got this. Ethan caught her in a meeting a week later. Lila pitched a story, something about a whistleblower at a tech firm, her voice steady, green eyes lit with fire. The editors nodded, impressed, but Vanessa just rolled her eyes. Ethan sat at the back, arms crossed, tapping his pen. He didn't say a word, but he liked how she held her own. After, he lingered by her desk, dropping off a file himself instead of sending Miles. Good pitch, he muttered, barely meeting her gaze. Lila blinked, startled. Thanks. He walked off, heart thudding for no reason he could name. Claire watched from a distance, her calls to Ethan ignored. Vanessa fed her intel, Lila's hours, her habits. They didn't know it yet, but Lila was tougher than she looked, forged in Ashwood's grit. And Ethan? He was starting to feel something he couldn't shake, something tied to the girl with the camera and the stranger on his phone. The storm was coming, and it had hit hard. Leila Monroe had been grinding at Blackwell Media for months, and it was starting to show. Her eyes had shadows under them, her sweater dress swapped for a borrowed blazer she'd snagged from a thrift shop. She'd clawed her way up a little. Her whistleblower story ran front page on the website, and a couple editors tossed her grudging praise. But Vanessa Hart wasn't letting up. She'd hover near Lila's desk, tossing out barbs like grenades. Don't get cocky, Ashwood. One hit doesn't make you a star. Lila bit her tongue, kept her head down, and worked harder. She wasn't here to fight. She was here for the paycheck, for Grace back in Ashwood, for a shot at something bigger. Vanessa had other plans. She'd been stewing ever since Ethan started lingering around Lila. Those quick drop-offs, that clipped good pitch he'd thrown her way. It gnawed at her, jealousy twisting into something ugly. She'd teamed up with Claire Dawson, the redhead with the fake marriage certificate, and they'd been plotting. One Friday, Vanessa sauntered over to Lila's desk, all fake smiles, and slid a napkin across it. Scribbled on it was an address, an industrial stretch outside Boston. "Need you to meet a source," she said, voice too smooth. "Big tip on a corruption story. Go now, don't screw it up." Lila frowned, glancing at the napkin. It didn't feel right, too vague, too sudden, but Vanessa was her boss. "Okay," she said, grabbing her coat and camera. "I'll check it." The bus dropped her off near a row of crumbling warehouses, the air thick with rust and damp. Lila stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, the city's hum a distant echo. The place was dead, windows busted, weeds choking the fences. She checked her phone, spotty signal, but she texted her mystery husband anyway. "Heading to a weird spot for work. Back soon." She shoved it in her pocket and walked toward the address, a hulking building with a sagging roof. The door creaked open under her hand, and she stepped inside, the dark swallowing her whole. Ethan Blackwell was in his office when his phone buzzed. He read Lila's text, brow furrowing. Weird spot? He didn't know why it bugged him. His wife was just a name, a deal. But something felt off. He tried to shake it, burying himself in a stack of contracts, but an hour later she hadn't texted back. He fired off a quick, "You good?" No reply. His gut twisted. He called Miles, his assistant, voice sharp, "Track this number." Now. Miles didn't ask questions. He knew Ethan's tone meant business. 10 minutes later he called back, signals faint, pinging near some old docks outside town. Ethan grabbed his keys, jacket, half on, and bolted. Back at the warehouse, Lila knew she'd walked into a trap the second the door slammed shut. Shadows moved. 2 guys, big and silent, blocking her way out. Then Vanessa stepped into the light, her smile cold as steel. "Thought you could take him from me, huh?" she hissed, stepping closer. Lila's heart slammed against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa laughed, bitter and unhinged. "Ethan, I was there when he had nothing, years ago, busting my ass for him, then you waltz in all small-town charm and he's hooked." Lila shook her head, confused. "I'm not after anyone." Vanessa didn't buy it. She nodded to the guys, and one grabbed Lila's arms, pinning them hard. The other swung a fist, catching her ribs. She gasped, pain exploding, but Vanessa wasn't done. "You don't belong here," she spat and shoved Lila to the ground. Lila hit the concrete, tasting blood, her camera skittering across the floor. She tried to crawl, but Vanessa loomed over her, grabbing a rusted pipe from a pile of junk. "This ends now," she said, raising it high. Lila braced herself, Grace's face flashing in her mind. Then headlights cut through the dark. A car screeched up outside, and Ethan burst in, his voice a roar. "Stop!" Vanessa froze, pipe mid-air as he charged her. She swung at him instead, wild and sloppy, but he dodged, tackling her hard. They hit the ground, her nails clawing at his face, screaming, "She's ruining everything!" The 2 goons bolted, disappearing into the night. Ethan pinned Vanessa, breathing ragged, until Miles ran in with a security guard from the office, cuffs snapping on her wrists. She thrashed, spitting curses, but they dragged her out. Ethan turned to Lila, crumpled against the wall, her lips split, ribs aching. "Hey," he said, softer now, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, shaky, green eyes wide. "Yeah, thanks." He helped her up, her weight leaning into him, and got her to his car. The drive to the hospital was quiet, her head against the window, his knuckles white on the wheel. At the ER, doctors swarmed. Bruised ribs, a cut lip, nothing broken, but plenty battered. Ethan sat by her bed, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. He didn't know why he stayed, didn't want to think about it, but watching her sleep, battered but breathing, hit him somewhere deep. He pulled out his phone, texting his wife, "Rough night, someone got hurt, should have been there sooner." Lila's phone, cracked but alive on the bedside table, lit up. She didn't stir, but Ethan saw the message, his message, on her screen. His breath caught. Same number. Same words. He stared at her, pieces clicking, but he didn't say a damn thing, not yet. Vanessa was gone, hauled off by cops, ranting about Ethan and Lila and some twisted loyalty she'd built in her head. Ethan didn't care. He looked at Lila, her face pale under the hospital lights, and felt something shift. Anger, sure, but something else too. She'd almost died, and he'd almost lost her, whoever she was to him. The truth was close, itching under his skin, but for now he just sat there, waiting for her to wake up. Lila Monroe woke up in a hospital bed, the beep of machines pulling her out of a foggy sleep. Her ribs throbbed, her lip stung where it had split, and the room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. She blinked, groggy, and saw Ethan Blackwell sitting there. Tie gone, shirt rumpled, his dark eyes locked on her. He looked like he hadn't slept, and for a second she wondered why he'd stuck around. "You're awake," he said, voice rough but soft. She nodded, wincing as she shifted. "Yeah? What happened?" He hesitated, jaw tight. "Vanessa jumped you. You're safe now. Cops have her." Lila's stomach twisted, the warehouse flashing back, Vanessa's pipe, that wild hate in her eyes. "Thanks," she mumbled, "for getting me out." Ethan didn't reply, just watched her, something heavy in his stare. She didn't get it, not yet. Her hand fumbled for her phone on the table, cracked screen lighting up. A text from her husband glowed there. "Rough night, someone got hurt, should have been there sooner." She frowned, typing back, slow with shaky fingers. "I'm okay. Got hurt too, but I'm alive. You?" Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and froze. Her message stared back at him. Same number he'd been texting for months. His heart slammed against his ribs. He'd seen it last night, her phone flashing his words, but now it was real, undeniable. Lila was his wife. He didn't say anything, just slipped his phone away and stood. "I'll drive you home," he said, voice steady despite the storm in his head. "You're in no shape to bus it." Lila nodded, too tired to argue, and let him help her up. The ride to Ashwood was quiet, her leaning against the window, him gripping the wheel like he'd keep his thoughts straight. When they pulled up to her little rental, a weathered house with a sagging porch, Grace was waiting, gray hair tied back, worry etched deep in her face. She rushed out, pulling Lila into a hug that made her wince. "Oh, honey, what happened?" Lila managed a weak smile. "Long story, Mom. I'm okay." Ethan hung back, hands in his pockets, as Grace ushered them inside. The place was small, cluttered with photos and old furniture, warm in a way his penthouse never was. Grace plopped Lila on the couch, fussing over her with a blanket, then turned to Ethan. "You're the one who brought her back?" He nodded. "Yeah." "Ethan Blackwell." Grace's eyes narrowed like she was digging through a memory, but she just said, "Well, thank you, Sit. You look beat." He did, sinking into a chair. Watching Lila sip water Grace shoved at her. Lila grabbed her phone again, needing that anchor, her husband. She texted, "Made it home, still reeling. You ever feel like the world's spinning too fast?" Ethan's phone pinged across the room. He didn't pull it out this time, just stared at her, then stood and walked over. "Lila," he said, low and careful. "Check who you just sent that to." She frowned, confused, and tapped her screen. The number stared back, same as always. Then she glanced at him, at his pocket where the buzz had come from. Her breath hitched. "Wait." She dialed it, hands trembling, and his phone rang right there in front of her. "Ethan?" she whispered, voice breaking. He nodded, slow. "Yeah, it's me. Been me the whole time." Her head spun, pieces crashing together. Those texts, the late-night rants, the guy she'd leaned on without knowing. "You're my husband?" He sat beside her, close but not touching. "Didn't know it was you either. The agency messed up. Signed us together, not Claire. Found out last night when Miles dug into it. She's a fraud. You're the real deal." Lila's eyes widened, green and searching. "All those messages? That was you?" He smirked, faint. "Everyone." Craze, watching from the kitchen doorway, piped up. "Hold on. Blackwell. 10 years ago, after my husband died, some kid from Boston paid his hospital bill. Never got a name, just a note saying keep the camera. Was that you?" Ethan froze, memory clicking. He'd been 22, doing charity runs for Margaret, and Ashwood had stuck with him. A girl with a camera, crying by a bedside. "Yeah," he said, voice thick. "That was me." Lila's jaw dropped. "You knew my dad?" He shook his head. "Not really, just saw you. Didn't connect it till now." She stared, the weight of it sinking in. Her husband, her boss, the stranger who'd saved her twice, years apart. Grace chuckled, breaking the tension. "Well, damn. Guess you two were meant to tangle up." Lila didn't laugh. She just looked at him, heart pounding, the truth a knot she couldn't untie yet. Lila Monroe sat on her Ashwood porch 3 days later, the Vermont air crisp and golden. Ethan Blackwell was next to her, his suit swapped for a worn sweater, looking less like a CEO and more like a guy who'd finally exhaled. The divorce papers, formalities from their fake start, had cleared yesterday, leaving them free. Not that they wanted out. Grace's words still echoed, meant to tangle up. Maybe she was right. They'd talked it out that first night, how Lila signed up for Grace, how Ethan did it for his empire. No more secrets, just truth laid bare. "I don't want to run," Lila said, green eyes steady. "Not from you." Ethan took her hand, his grip warm. "Good, 'cause I'm not letting go." He pulled a small box from his pocket, a silver chain with a green stone, like her eyes. "For you," he said, fastening it around her neck. "No more pretending." She touched it, throat tight, and leaned into him. Back in Boston, her stories were climbing at Blackwell Media. Vanessa locked up, Claire gone. Margaret met her once, gruff but approving. Keep him honest. Lila smiled. They weren't strangers anymore. Just two people who'd found home.